Hi everyone. My name is Melissa Zablonski, and I'm a social studies teacher at Putnam High School in Northeast Connecticut, where I primarily teach US history. And so tonight, what I really wanted to talk about is how I plan daily connections in my lessons between the historical topics that we're discussing and the present day, so that students can better understand the why behind learning history. So I really have been working hard the past 3 years to make sure my history lessons are relevant for my students. I find that I have students on either end of the spectrum where they either really love history or they really hate it, and very few fall in between. So I get a lot of I hate history. I do terrible in my history classes. Why are we learning this? Shouldn't we really be spending time learning about what we're reading in the news and what's happening now as opposed to what happened before? And so I saw students really struggling to see the relevance of learning about something like the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age, even the 1920s and the Great Depression. So I really wanted to think, how can we help them better understand this information while connecting it to our history lessons, especially because they're exposed to more information than ever. They're on their phones all the time. They see headlines, they see TikToks, they see things on Instagram about stuff that's happening today, but they don't really fully understand it. So by connecting that information that they're getting to our history lessons, not only can help them make history more relevant and help them understand history, but also understand better what it is that they're being told today about current events that are happening. And just an important note before I really get into it, as current events change, so will these lessons. I don't know that I've taught these lessons the same for the past couple of years, because as things change about those topics, I update the lessons. So you might watch this recording months from now and something might not necessarily be relevant anymore, but that's also kind of the fun of it, is that I get to change things every year, or even sometimes every few weeks or every couple of months, because new things are happening and new things are changing. So that's just the challenge with this, is just to keep updating the lessons or create new ones so that those connections really do stay relevant. But I think it's a fun challenge to take on. I wanted to talk about 5 areas that I use or that I connect for the present day to when I'm going through our units of study. So I want to talk about the Gilded Age, where we really focus on historical issues of women's rights and child labor, and then connect them to the status of the Equal Rights Amendment today, as well as child labor on farms in the United States today. The Progressive Era, when we learn about muckrakers and the reform movements, they do a mini project exposing modern day issues. When we look at imperialism in World War I, we take a really deep dive into different foreign policies that different imperialist presidents put forth. And then we look at how we can use that information to advise the president today. With the 1920s, we're taking a look at the Scopes trial and the Harlem Renaissance and how those relate to modern issues like the Florida book ban and the Black Lives Matter movement. And then I have an enrichment activity that I have students do where they pick a current event, and that's really student driven. So that's just an overview of some of the things that I want to touch on tonight. Obviously, we go into more historical topics within these units, but I just wanted to pick a few things that I think might be interesting to share. So starting with the Gilded Age, like I said, we look at women in the workplace during the Gilded Age, women's suffrage, and child labor. And the current topics that we connect to those historical topics are the wage gap between women and men, but also particularly between women and women who are mothers, the Equal Rights Amendment, and child labor on US farms. So when we talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, we go through kind of a little activity as a class together where we look at 5 different steps, basically. So students learn about women's suffrage and the fight that women had to endure in order to get that right to vote. But then we talk about today how even though women have the right to vote, and we do have quite a few more rights, we still don't actually have equal rights guaranteed within our Constitution. And the students are usually super surprised to learn that. And that helps them really understand and put in perspective the fact that, okay, yeah, historically women had to fight for the right to vote, but now We actually have to kind of take a page from their book and learn about how we can fight for women to have solidified equal rights today. So we look at the language first of the Equal Rights Amendment, where it says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the US or by any state on account of sex. So we break that down together. And then we watch a video from 2020 when Virginia became the last state needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And we have a little bit of a, I would guess you could call it like a debate type of discussion after we watch this video, because the deadline to approve the Equal Rights Amendment has long passed. And so students really get into discussing whether or not Virginia's vote to approve the ERA should be honored and it should be put into effect, or if there needs to be a whole new revote and starting from square one, basically, to put the ERA into effect. And students really enjoy thinking critically about that topic and discussing, their knowledge of the Constitution and the way that works, but also should there be exceptions made to these constitutional processes in order to give women the equal rights that they deserve. The next thing that we really take a look at are two different primary source texts. One is from a female representative in 1969, where she argues for the passage of the ERA. And then the other one that they take a look at, which I don't have pictured here, is by Phyllis Schlafly, who was very opposed to passing the ERA. And students take a look at the different arguments that each woman gives in support or against the ERA. They discuss which arguments they think are valid, which ones they feel have some merit to them. And then we discuss as a class how these two arguments really made it difficult for the ERA to actually get passed and be solidified within the Constitution. The next thing that we take a look at are two current event articles about the Equal Rights Amendment. And students look at basically the way that the Equal Rights Amendment could change the status of women today. But then we also take a look at other consequences that could happen as well, and what the Equal Rights Amendment could mean for people of the LGBTQ plus community, people of other races, people of other national origins. And it really gets students seeing how even today, hundreds of years after the Constitution has been passed, although it looks like we've made a lot of progress as a country, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made. And our Constitution and our laws really still do favor white heterosexual males over other people of the population. So with these articles, students really have these open-ended questions where they're thinking about which area gives the most important reason for passing the ERA. So one of the articles goes over a ton of information about why the ERA should be passed. Why might the passage of the amendment matter to them? And this one's interesting, especially for male identifying students, because they struggle to think about how Equal Rights Amendment would impact them in any way. They think about why it might matter to the people around me, like their family, their friends, their teachers, whoever else, and then why it might matter to the US as a whole. And so that's really how we connect to women's suffrage. But then we talk about, all right, well, voting rights weren't the only issue that women faced during the Gilded Age. They were also facing, wage gaps and being paid much less than men. And that's still the case today. So we watched this really cool episode of Explain from Netflix, and you can get the full episode on YouTube. I can send copies of these documents out so you have these links. And we look at what the real reason is that women end up making less money than men. And the video does a really, really great job of explaining how once a woman has children, she has to basically put her career on pause while men can continue working and move their way up the ladder. And so students take a look at that, and they also are able to learn about other countries such as Iceland that offer really great maternity and paternity leave, and think about how the US could change our practices in order to solve this issue here. So that's the one current connection to women's rights. Then we take a look at child labor in the US today. So students really look at, during the Gilded Age, the issues that the country faced when it came to employing children in dangerous industries. And they think that today there's plenty of child labor laws that make it so that's not the case. I have a lot of students say, well, I would love to get a job at age 13 or 14, but the law says I can't. So really the US is almost restricting us. But then we take a look at the fact that employment laws and like federal laws against child labor often have loopholes to get around in terms of using child labor on farms. And so students really kind of do this inquiry activity where they look at different sources in order to learn about child laborers on the farms, what their experiences are, what rules exist to protect them on the farms. Why is it important for Americans to be aware of this? And then also they take a look at an act being pushed through Congress, the Children's Act for Responsible Employment and Farm Safety, and they discuss how that could help improve conditions for child farm workers. And basically the culminating activity for this modern day connection is for students to make an infographic or flyer on Canva or another means and advocate for why the Children's Act for Responsible Employment and Farm Safety should be passed. So they basically are making kind of like a political activism flyer where they are trying to educate others on the issue of child labor on farms in the US, and then also educate them on the act and why they should advocate for that act to be passed. And so students really are engaged in this lesson as well, because they realize that children younger than they are at this point are exposed to these harsh chemicals, are working long hours, are being kind of not forced, but basically forced to sacrifice an education in order to provide for their families. And so they start to get really passionate about this issue of social justice in the US. And so they really do create some great flyers to educate others about the issue that we then hang up in the classroom and hang up around schools so that people can become more aware. When we move on to the progressive era, we cover a ton of topics throughout the unit as well, but the one that I really want to focus on are muckrakers and reform movements. And the way that we connect that to today is basically a student choice project, and they pick a current issue that they're really passionate about and they propose solutions, whether they write an editorial, they create a brochure, they create a flyer, they create some kind of like commercial or PSA type of announcement. And students also really get passionate about this, especially because they are able to choose something that they feel matters to them. So after we learn about how muckrakers are journalists that expose the wrongs in society, we learn about specific muckrakers, we learn about progressive reformers and how they specifically tackled social issues. Students then pick an issue of their own. And one of the things that they're able to do is write an editorial. So I included an example of what that looks like here. So after we talked about problems in the Gilded Age, the Industrial Revolution, students pick one from society today. And I've had a lot of students pick things ranging anywhere from issues of healthcare availability to racism. And when students pick a big topic like racism, I ask them to narrow it down a little bit. So, all right, what about racism? Is it inequities in healthcare because of race? Is it inequities in education because of race? Is it racial violence? I ask them to narrow it down, because racism, when they pick that, as they start to propose solutions and think about really the nuances of it, they realize that it's broad and overwhelming. So having them really pick like a really focused issue helps with this assignment. I've had students choose saving marine life and the ocean and turtles, students looking at human trafficking. But what students do is really, they take charge of this assignment and they pick their sources that they're going to use to learn about the problem they've chosen. They then write their editorial or create their PSA. And the outline that I have here, I use with some of my lower level students to help them frame their ideas. But what they're supposed to do is, whatever product they choose, they are describing the topic and why it's important to be educated on the topic. Why is it important to learn about this issue? And then they're explaining positive and negative effects of the issue. The reason that we include positive effects is because it just gets them thinking critically about, for example, if they chose healthcare and the fact that, we don't have, state-run healthcare like countries in Europe do, they think about some of the positives associated with our current system, but then they have the challenge of explaining, all right, well, why do those negatives ultimately outweigh the positives? So being able to address those counter arguments is a skill that we really work on in my class, because they have difficulty doing that sometimes. So they're talking about positive effects and negative effects. And then in the conclusion, or where at whatever section of the project on the product they're creating, they create their own suggestions for solving those problems. So when they look at these negative effects of the problem, they propose a solution, and it can't just be pass a law or create an organization to help them. I ask them to be very specific. So if they want a law to be passed to address the problem, what kind of provision should that law include? What should that law do? What kind of funding would be needed for it? So asking them to be specific about it so that they can't just put like a blanket band-aid or solution on it and then think that that's fine. Then I also ask how these suggestions can be implemented. So again, if they say this law needs to be passed, well, how do we get that law passed? Does there need to be like campaigning? Does there need to be, again, like funding or something like that? And then why should people care? So give us the why. Why should people care about solving inequities in healthcare? Why should people who have great healthcare care about helping those who don't? And that's really, students find it really fulfilling and also challenging when they do this assignment because they are really passionate about their topic. They are able to recognize injustices in society, but the thing that they often don't usually think about is how to fix it. So they take a page out of some progressive reformers books to look at ways that they might fix a problem. Some of them say things like going on strike or staging protests, petitions, things like that. And they take those from what they've learned from these progressive reformers that we've discussed. So that's one of the ways that we connect in the progressive era to the modern day. Some other things that I do as well is when we talk about the formation of unions, students do a collective bargaining simulation. We talk about how unions are important to them today. They read articles and watch some videos about the role they can play in unions if they become a unionized worker and how they'll be protected. And again, they find it really practical knowledge to learn, and they are engaged in it because they finally can see why this matters to them and what they can learn about history and how history can help them advance their causes and advocate for their interests even today. Next is imperialism and World War I. So we cover a lot of historical topics in this unit. We look at Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson's foreign policies. We look at the territories that the US acquired and the treatment of the peoples in those territories. The Spanish-American War. We look at the reasons the US entered into World War I and then how that affected the home front. And then we really look at the role the US played in wrapping up the First World War with the League of Nations. And two of the ways that we connect this to current topics are looking at Puerto Rico and the statehood debate, and then also an advising the president activity that I do with students. So when we talk about American territories, we talk about how some of these territories still are not fully independent today. We still have American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, to name a few. And we read during, our unit on imperialism, how a lot of territories gained independence or were able to become free, but others became states or others are still territories today. I have a lot of students, particularly from Puerto Rico, so we take a look at why or whether or not Puerto Rico should become a state. And my students, especially from Puerto Rico, get really invested in this debate that we have. My school subscribes to something called SIRS Issue Researcher, which is a really great database if you don't know. And basically, the database has tons of different controversial issues within it, and it provides students with peer-reviewed resources that address both sides of the issues. It gives an overview of the issue itself, and then it gives the two sides of the issue and appropriate resources for students to use. So I have students use that when they are doing their research for this assignment, but when it comes to articles and things about the status of Puerto Rico, you can find tons of great stuff just on Google. So when they go to the issue researcher, they look at the summary on the first page. And what students are doing is just getting some background information for themselves. So how does a Commonwealth differ from a state? What options exist for Puerto Rico status, and what do they think should be the chosen option? What are some of the struggles that Puerto Rico faces when it comes to gaining statehood? And why basically did the referendums in Puerto Rico to vote them as a state not necessarily see success? Then they take a look at both sides of the issue. So students are required to look at the side that Puerto Rico should become a state and Puerto Rico possibly should not become a state. It's not the best option. And they have to choose 2 articles from each side and provide evidence from those articles. When they do that, they're going to pick which side they want to really support in the debate. So students write out their ideas in step 4 for the debate, and then we actually discuss it as a class. So this part is kind of to help them plan. And then as a class is when we actually really get into the nitty gritty of it. So some of the arguments have to do with taxes and, healthcare and things like that. And so students really take a look at some things that they might not have considered when it comes to statehood for Puerto Rico. They think it would just be easy to add Puerto Rico as a state or make them independent, but they don't necessarily look at how that would affect things like education and the economy. So in step 4, they are looking at their stance. So they write a paragraph that basically is their opening statement where they include background on the issue and their thesis. In paragraph 2, they're explaining their argument with specific evidence. They're providing a counter argument in the 3rd paragraph. And then the last paragraph, they have to restate their thesis, but also connect it to what they've learned about US imperialism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So basically, based on how the US acted during this imperialist period, how does that support your argument? How does that prove that Puerto Rico should become a state or Puerto Rico should not become a state? So it's asking them to make those connections so that they can really see, all right, these historical actions have had these modern day effects, and where should we go from here as a country? The final assessment that I had students do in this unit this year was a letter to President Biden. So after we had learned about imperialism, we learned about the role of the United States in World War I, students addressed this scenario. And I let students use their previous assignments on their tests because I'm really looking to see, not that they can just spit back their information, but that they can apply it. So the scenario here was that President Biden needs advising on his foreign policy regarding the situation between Ukraine and Russia. He thought the war would be over by now, but a year of fighting between the 2 countries is approaching. President Biden would like advice as to whether the US should join the war and help bring peace to Europe. Your knowledge of American imperialism and American involvement in World War I means that you can provide some advice to the president that is based on America's historical experiences. So they're using that knowledge from the unit to advise President Biden today about how he should handle the situation. So the big question is, should America basically directly intervene in Ukraine? And in the first paragraph, they're addressing whether or not overall they think America has been a bully or a leader historically when it comes to its involvement in other countries. Based on that reputation and perception, they need to argue whether or not America should intervene in Ukraine. The next thing that they do is they choose a foreign policy, so Roosevelt, Taft, or Wilson, and argue which policy Biden should most closely follow when dealing with Ukraine and Russia. So should he follow the more economic approach of Taft, the more moral approach of Wilson, or the speak softly, carry a big stick approach of Teddy Roosevelt, and why that policy that they choose would be the best for him to kind of take example of. The next paragraph, students really are talking about what they've learned from America's experiences in World War I. So should Biden follow Wilson's lead and try to stay as neutral as possible in the conflict? What could happen if he does? What could happen if he doesn't? What effects could joining the war have on our home front? And then when it came to our role as, or Wilson's role in negotiating the peace of World War I, what should Biden learn from that? Does America want that responsibility again? Should we try to do something similar to what was done in World War I? That's what they have to argue. So then lastly, they're just concluding it by reminding Biden of their position, and then overall, why should we or should we not intervene in Ukraine? Students really got into this. They really seem to like letter writing, especially. And so they liked this activity because they took their historical knowledge, they acted like experts, and were able to tell the president what they think he should do in the situation. And they actually had historical reasoning to back up their arguments. So the last unit that I wanted to talk about is the 1920s. And so 2 of the topics that are covered in this unit are the Scopes monkey trial and the Harlem Renaissance. And the current topics that we really looked at this year were the Florida education bans and Black Lives Matter. So when it came to the Scopes trial, we learned about the trial itself. Students did an analysis of different primary source documents from that trial. And that's what we've been doing for all these historical activities for each of the units I've talked about. They do a lot of primary source analyzing, they do a lot of discussions in their groups, and then take that to apply it to these current event activities. So this year with these headlines earlier in 2023 with DeSantis enacting all these education laws, I don't want to get too controversial here, but enacting laws that are banning certain books, banning certain things from being taught in history classes. We, after learning about the Scopes trial, really talked about that. And students were surprised because they didn't know that this was happening. And so what we did in this case was students read an article about the erasure of Black history from Florida schools. They read the article that's on the left here. And then on a Google Jamboard, they had discussion groups. So in each of the discussion groups, there were a couple questions that I posted that I wanted to make sure students addressed. And then they, in a different color Post-it note, posted questions that their group came up with based on the article. So as a group, they answered the questions that I had posed, and then they went into other people's Jamboard pages and answered the questions that other groups had asked based on their reading. And then afterwards, we went through the questions together as a class and had a really, I would say, really valuable whole class discussion about the fact that, this is happening today and what should be done about it. So you can see, here's a screenshot from one group's discussion board and some of the questions they asked. If you were a Floridian, would you move out immediately if you knew this was happening? Or who determines when a teacher is not following the guidelines of the law? Are students talking to their parents about what is being taught? And so they really were getting some great questions from this article because they really had trouble comprehending the fact that, well, our school this year just started teaching a Black Latino studies course, and now a few hundred miles south from us, they're trying to take all of that away from schools. So it was a really stimulating discussion for students, and it was a great way to show them that, again, 100 years after the Scope trial happened, we're still dealing with the same kind of issue today. And then one of the most popular lessons that I think I do that connects to the modern day is when we compare the Harlem Renaissance and Black Lives Matter. So throughout the 1920s unit, we talk about race relations in the 1920s. We talk about the art of the Harlem Renaissance, poetry, all of that. But then we take it a step further and connect it to art, poetry, and music from the Black Lives Matter movement. So students in this activity have a graphic organizer on the left, and then they also have access to slides that I put together where they have sections for music, poetry, and art. They look at examples from the Harlem Renaissance in each of those areas. They look at examples from Black Lives Matter in each of those areas. And then they compare the themes and the messages between the two movements. So really they're looking at ways that certain problems are still enduring for the Black community. They look at certain successes that have been had over time for the Black community, and they really take a look at what has changed in the last 100 years for the Black community. The end, culminating activity for this is students make a visual Venn diagram. So they have on one side Harlem Renaissance, one side Black Lives Matter, and they find pictures that represent the themes and the messages of each of these movements, and they put them in the appropriate parts of the organizer, and then write a little narrative explaining how are the two movements similar, what does it tell us about the struggle of Black Americans over time, and really what can we learn from both of these movements today in relation to racism in the United States. And so students really like that, especially the music section, because they really get into, music that they're hearing or listening to on Spotify today. And it gets them really hyped up that, oh, we might be listening to some songs that have a little bit of questionable language in it, but we're doing it in school. So for some reason, it's more alluring to them. And then finally, I have a current event enrichment activity that students can do. So if they finish an assignment early, or sometimes on days that I might have a meeting or something like that, I often have students do a current event. So they choose their own article. They include citation information, they find quotes from the article and explain their significance, they summarize the article, but the really important section that they have to address is the opinions and connections section. So in that section, students look at what their opinion is on the issue that was discussed, what they think they should be done, and then they have to connect it to our current unit of study. And that can be challenging. So I had students do an article about abortion, and we were talking about the Gilded Age. So students really had to think about, all right, well, what are some of the deeper issues with abortion rights, and how can that connect to some of the deeper issues of the Gilded Age? Where are those connections, or where can those connections be made? And so sometimes they have to really think outside the box, but I've seen some really cool connections that students have made between current events that are happening and what we're learning in history class that I never would have just put together myself. So it's a really good exercise for students to figure out how current events connect to what we're learning, and not just me telling them, all right, this is the connection that we're making. So I went through kind of some of the earlier units that we cover in a US history course. But if you want to think about other topics like World War II, the Cold War, civil rights, think about some of those parallel lessons that you can teach to connect those topics to current events so that students can be more engaged and just overall better informed about what's happening today and how history has played a role in that. So I want to just thank you for watching. If you have any questions, suggestions, or thoughts, you can look at my email on the Putnam High School website, and I'd be more than happy to answer whatever or chat about whatever. So thank you very much and enjoy your night.